the book of Zephaniah, you can tell that I'm not going by the handout very much because I've just put some quick thoughts there on the handout to follow up later, but I want to go more through the text with those books. The word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. I've already mentioned that this is very unusual, that Zephaniah isn't just identified by name, not even by his full name, Zephaniah, son of Cushi, that would be quite enough, but given a little genealogy. Why might that be? Do you have any thoughts why Zephaniah might he introduce? Scholars have basically 2 or 3 thoughts on that. You put him in a larger context, although usually for those, I mean, for us it's not really telling us a lot more because we don't know precisely where they live, but in the ancient world, when you give someone's full name, Zephaniah, son of Cushi, you might also know where they live, because they live on their land that's been given to them by the different tribes. And so it would be like an address. And you think usually, through the rest of the Bible, it is sufficient to say the name and the father's name, and then you can place someone, you know where they're coming from. Yes, there are different Gedaliahs showing up, though. Yeah, so this very good. That's one reason, and in fact, on the whole, the more sensible reason. But it's getting us close to. So there are maybe 3 options. One is, it's just what it is. There's no particular reason for it. I don't buy that because we don't get that usually. Even one commentator even says, look, when Saul is introduced, he's given that full genealogy as well. So it shows that sometimes it just happens. And I said, well, what do you mean sometimes? This is the first king of Israel. Of course he's given a fuller genealogy. It's not by accident. This is a very important person. You want to know where he's coming from and stuff. So, yeah, I do expect when I get a full name, a little genealogy like that, I expect there to be a reason for that. Some people have speculated that the reason is Cushi. They speculated that, Cushi, the Ethiopian, Zephaniah is the son of the Ethiopian. Maybe people were a bit wondering, oh, that's a bit dodgy. How can he be a prophet? Son of an Ethiopian. How can a son of an Ethiopian be a prophet? We'll better add some more names so to show that he really is a true Judean. Son of Gedaliah, good Judean name. He has the name of God in his name, like Zephaniah. Amariah, another one with the divine name in his name. Hezekiah, another one with his divine name. To kind of gloss over Cushi, the Ethiopian who doesn't have a divine name element in his name. You know Mount Zion? Mount Zion, yeah, you know Mount Zion from the Bible. You probably haven't been to Jerusalem. But if you were to go to Jerusalem and you ask around, where's Mount Zion? You even see signs of Mount Zion. You go to Mount Zion and you won't be where Mount Zion is. Because the biblical Mount Zion is a different mountain. Jerusalem was built on Mount Zion, so the city of David is on Mount Zion. I'll build you Jerusalem here. Because Jerusalem is built like on a very narrow ridge. So I need to get rid of those, like this. I'm trying to show that this is a ridge that grows a little bit, and then it goes a little bit further down, like that, and then there's a higher mountain still. And this is a well-protected part, because it goes down here and further, and there's a valley here and a valley there, and so on. So this is Mount Zion, where the city of David was built, the Jerusalem that he conquered. And this hill is the hill on which the temple was built, Mount Moriah. And as you know from the Psalms, Jerusalem is surrounded by hills. So there are hills here all over, except nowadays, of course, Jerusalem, is still a little bit surrounded by hills, but Jerusalem has grown, so it is on the hills as well. So those other hills around here are now part of Jerusalem as well, including the western hill here, and that is now Mount Zion. And it is a beautiful place, has some very significant churches there, and it's where we commemorate the Last Supper and so on. But it's not where Zion used to be. This may have happened with Ethiopia, that the ancients, when they used it, like the Greek, the Septuagint translation, when they use Ethiopia, what do they refer to? Well, they don't refer to Addis, because Addis didn't exist. We know that's only 150 years old or so. They refer to probably what is now also called Nubia, that region, and it's kind of Sudan region. But it seems that the term Ethiopia has also moved around a little bit, and partly because Ethiopia has grown, become such an empire, sort of just incorporating the different regions. And then what would now be quite a northerly region of contemporary Ethiopia, or even north of Ethiopia, that has been incorporated as a term for Ethiopia. So the significance for Israel and Judah was Cush, Ethiopia, was the furthest, the ends of the earth, literally. It's the furthest that you can think of. They didn't know about anything further south. It's the furthest south part. And so it's, many of the references to Cush, I think, are to reference to, in parallel to the far-flung islands. Just like Tarshish, probably in Spain, was the furthest west they knew about. They obviously had no idea about America and so on. So this is the ends of the earth. One end of the earth is Tarshish, another end is Cush. And where exactly where it was depends on the political situations in the ancient world and today and how to relate them. Well, I don't really want to enter that debate. Well, to translate it as Sudan, I think would be a bit odd. I find a bit odd, because Sudan, I think, is a fairly modern term. And just like Babylonia is roughly centered where today is Iraq, but it's got nothing to do with Iraq in that sense. You wouldn't translate it as Iraq, and that would make any sense, because that's a modern state that occupies something that partly overlaps with Chaldean. There's a bit more sense in Iran and Persia. There's quite a bit of overlap there. But all the references are to the ancient Persian kingdom in the Bible, so you wouldn't translate that as Iran. And I think in a similar way, to me, maybe I'm misinformed on that, but to me, Sudan is quite a modern term, and so ill-placed to designate a region. That's why a number of English translations, I think, use, if they translate it rather than just say Cush, as I do, just opting out of something, would go for Nubia, because that's more of an old name for that region that doesn't relate to any political entity today. Now, Ethiopia is different from Sudan because it's a very old term. As we see, we find it in the Septuagint. That's how the Septuagint translates Cush a good number of times, maybe always. I haven't checked it out. And so that's where the tradition comes from to translate Cush as Ethiopia, along with the Septuagint, which makes more sense to me than Sudan, because Ethiopia is the term for an old kingdom there in the south of Egypt, while Sudan is a modern term. But the tricky business about translating it with Ethiopia, that the Ethiopia of the ancient world is certainly not directly identical with the Ethiopia today. That realm would have maybe overlapped, but it wouldn't have been quite the same realm. So some people argue that Zephaniah, the Ethiopian, people wanted to shore up his Judean credentials by adding a few more names, but this doesn't make sense to me, because adding Gedaliah would have been quite enough. then you know it's a Judeans, and you don't need two more names. And B, there's no hint in the prophetic literature as well of animosity towards the Cushites. There's some Cushites Jeremiah has a Cushite friend, so he's very significant in helping him out. So there's no sense that someone is a son of a Cushi, so what? It doesn't need further genealogy. Of course, we don't even know whether Cushi was an Ethiopian or whether he was simply called Cushi. Maybe he was a kind of a normal Judean who had a particularly dark skin, so they called him Cushi. The parents thought, oh, we've got a really dark-skinned child here, let's call him Cushi, because there's nothing wrong with being called Cushi, so why not? Or maybe Gedaliah was married to an Ethiopian woman, and that's why Cushi turns out a bit darker. Yeah, so that would be my favorite speculation, but we don't know. Maybe Gedaliah was married to an Ethiopian. I think the reason why we have the genealogy is not really to do with Cushi, but with Hezekiah. If you count back, Zephaniah, son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, you end up in a territory where this Hezekiah could be King Hezekiah. It could work out chronologically. We're not told that it is King Hezekiah, so we cannot be certain, but it could work. So it is possible that Zephaniah has royal descent, which would be interesting in terms that he's related to Josiah. That would be the interesting thing. But I don't think that would be the main reason. Because, so what? He is of royal descent, so what? It doesn't give his message more authority or less authority. Because either he's a true prophet of God, and then he can be born of two Cushites who recently immigrated, or he can be of a royal descent right back to David. Doesn't matter. That doesn't give him more or less authority. I think what does matter is having this long genealogy makes us think about King Hezekiah. And for that, it doesn't matter whether this Hezekiah is actually the king or not. But Hezekiah being put so close together with Josiah makes us think of King Hezekiah. And I think that's what's going on rhetorically. We are meant to think of good King Hezekiah, good King Josiah, son of Ammon, not so good king of Judah, and then king of Judah. Why? I think because we already get a hint here that the theme of kingship is going to be quite important. Who is a good, true king here? And that theme is underlined by having Hezekiah there as well. Josiah and Hezekiah were the two good kings in the latter half of Judean reign. Because Josiah was the king in whose reign there was a big reform, many scholars have found it very frustrating to be told in the days of Josiah, but not whether it's before or after the reform. That would seem to be the big question. And so there's one big debate going on. Did Zephaniah start prophesying before the reform and maybe was part of giving force to the reform movement? Or was there this reform movement after the finding of the book of the law, and then Zephaniah comes along and supports that as well? And of course, we're not told. We're not told the answer. Many scholars lean towards a later date because they say a lot of Zephaniah sounds like Deuteronomy. And they think that Deuteronomy was the book that was found or even written in the days of Josiah when he was discovering this law book. So if Josiah had written before the reform, he couldn't use Deuteronomy language because that book was lost and was only found afterwards. So if Zephaniah uses language that sounds a lot like Deuteronomy here and there, then that suggests to them that he must have written after this law book, which is very often usually identified as Deuteronomy, came to light. And then he was using that language. And probably, again, adopting a bit of a minority view, I question that on several counts. One is, I believe that it is much less clear than many people think that the book of the law that was found was Deuteronomy. Yes, the language that is used in Kings is very much linked with Deuteronomy, but that's simply because that's the way the author of Kings works. He uses a lot more language of Deuteronomy than of Leviticus and Numbers or Exodus. So when he talks about finding the book of the law, he may think of the whole Pentateuch, but he's obviously using language of Deuteronomy because that's what he uses throughout the book. That's his particular interest. So the fact that there are a number of links with Deuteronomy doesn't actually prove that the book that was found was Deuteronomy. So that's one question mark I put against that. The other is, what does it mean for that book to be found? Why does it need to be found? It doesn't actually mean that the book was unknown before it was found. In those days, there wouldn't be many copies around of biblical literature as far as it was available, because it is very expensive to produce books in those days. I don't think there would necessarily have been to be single copies, but there wouldn't have been many, and most of them would be in the Jerusalem temple. And the priests, of course, would be trained in those books and would learn from those books and would know a lot of that by heart. I suspect that the book of the covenant of the law wasn't even lost, because it doesn't say in Kings that it was lost. It only says that it was found. But it was hidden, because there were a number of evil kings, including Ammon, although he was only a short time, but then Manasseh as well for a long time. They weren't very favorable towards God's law. So those precious ancient copies of the law could well have been hidden by the faithful priests so that a king wouldn't come around and do to it as he did to Jeremiah's scroll. Just crib it up and put it in the fire. Under Josiah, a faithful, good king, it was safe to find those scrolls again. So one, the book of the law doesn't have to be Deuteronomy. Two, to find it in that time doesn't mean it was unknown beforehand. It just means they may have worked from memory or from younger copies, and what was found there was a particularly old copy, and it was more the symbolic significance of finding this ancient covenant document that cut to Josiah's heart. It wasn't that for the first time he knew what was God's will. In fact, we read that he was a faithful king seeking to do God's will before he found the book of the law. So clearly, he knew a thing or two about what God expected. He didn't need the book of the law for that. What the book of the law that was found under Hilkiah, the priest, what that did was to drive home how old that covenant relationship was, how it was sealed in writing, and therefore how serious it was for Israel, Judah, to be not following the terms of the covenant. And so Josiah had actually started the reform movement before the book was found, but he then gave further impetus to that. So that's why I think it's perfectly possible for Zephaniah to know and use some of those typical Deuteronomy phrases even before that book of the law was found. That doesn't mean it has to be early, but my inclination is to think that Zephaniah was probably working earlier with or alongside Josiah's reform movement. Even so, it is surprising what we read right at the beginning, and it would be maybe even more surprising in the midst of a reform movement. Think of the Reformation. In the 16th century, finally people are hearing the gospel again, coming to faith, and then a prophet comes along and says this. Would someone like to read maybe verses 2 to 11 first? Thank you. That will be do. What do you think is going on here? What does that predict?
Judgment.
Yeah, definitely judgment. So that's what makes it slightly odd. In conjunction with the reform movement, you think, what things are going better than they have been for generations. For a while, Josiah is celebrating Passover again, which hadn't been properly celebrated for generations. And Zephaniah comes along and says, I will make a complete end of everything. I've had enough, God says. Of course, not quite so odd if we remember that when Josiah found, or the scroll was found and brought to Josiah, he inquired of the prophet. He didn't go to Zephaniah. We don't know why. Well, maybe Zephaniah had already preached that kind of stuff. I thought, don't want to hear that for the moment. Let's check out Huldah. But Huldah says that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So Huldah, in spite of all the reform and so on, Huldah was not giving any grounds of hope that Jerusalem's destruction could be postponed. So somehow the two things go together. This didn't discourage Josiah from pursuing reform. It's still worthwhile, but the end of Jerusalem was in sight there. But what's the end here? At first, of course, it looks like a completely universal cataclysm, the end of the world. And some people think that this is about the end of the world in the fullest sense of the word. Sweeping end of everything from the face of the ground, an end of human and animal, cut off humanity from the face of the ground, everyone dead. But actually, then it hones in on, I will stretch out my hand against Judah. And why would you need to say that? If it's the end of the world, it's the end of London, of Addis, of Jerusalem, who cares? But it focuses now on Judah, then on Jerusalem, against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, then specifying people in Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place any vestige of the master. That's I've translated in this way because it's ambiguous who they might address as master. So it's a term they should have used for God, but they used for other gods, it seems. The names of the cult attendants of the priests, those who offer obeisance, that is, who submit and worship to the host of heaven. We've got that picture in Jeremiah as well, people going onto their rooftops when they've got flat roofs and then worshiping the stars. Those who offer obeisance, who swear to the Lord, so they say, yeah, I'm a Yahweh worshipper, I swear by his name, but also swear by their king. And again, this is left ambiguous. Who's their king? Their king is meant to be the Lord God. But clearly here it is not, because they're swearing on the one hand by the Lord and on the other hand by their king, whether it's the human king or another divinity here. Yes, and in a number of places in the Old Testament, actually, but often we think of Baal worship as something completely pagan and separate from Yahweh worship, and I think sometimes that's what it was. That kind of a different deity was worshipped, the Baal of Peor or the Baal of this and so on. But sometimes what happened is that the people were worshipping maybe some Baal figure they called Yahweh. or they were worshipping Yahweh, but portraying him as if he were Baal. And so, what is that? Idolatry or false worship, and so on? It is maybe a parallel in Islam. Who is Allah? So, of course, one theological question is Allah the God we know, but completely misrepresented in the Quran? Or is it a different deity? But there can only be one who created the universe, and they're both supposed to have created the universe. If you were to start a Christian church and you sing worship songs to God, and then in your worship songs you portray God in terms that are taken straight from the Quran more, and you worship God for his 99 names and so on, and you think, yeah, some of them, yeah, of course God is gracious and merciful. So you think, oh, what's going on there? What is that? And it's that kind of worship, I think, that they had in those days. You couldn't clearly say that they're worshiping another God. At some level, you could say, yeah, they call themselves a Christian church. They praise God. But the way they do that looks a lot more like Islam to me. And so, like, what would be, Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, call themselves Christian. When they go on missionaries, they say, we're one form of Christianity. And often, certainly in the West, I think, on religious syllabus, there's Christianity, and Christianity has those Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox and Protestants and Jehovah's Witnesses. I say, no, Jehovah's Witnesses, they're not Christian by any stretch of the imagination. You've got to believe that Christ is God to be a Christian, we would say. So, but they think of themselves as Christian. And so there seem to have been those who think of themselves as true Yahweh worshippers, but they're worshipping Yahweh in a way, they're believing things about Yahweh that look a lot more like Baal worship. And so the prophecy doesn't acknowledge them as true worshippers of God. They're mixing things up. In reality, they turn aside from following the Lord. They do not seek the Lord and do not inquire of him. Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, very good observation. I think politically, as I said, Jeroboam's interest was in people not going to Jerusalem to worship for the main festivals, because they might then have great allegiance to the south and want reunification of the country. And he wants to keep control of 3/4 of the ancient United Kingdom, Israel. And so he creates these other places, but he doesn't want to introduce new gods. He wants them to worship Yahweh in Bethel and in Dan, rather than in Jerusalem. But the way he does it, and with the statutes and so on, it is not true worship. Possibly similar to what happened when Moses was on Mount Sinai. Aaron presents the golden calf. I mean, golden calf is probably what a narrator calls it. They were thinking of it more as a mighty oxen, and the narrator says it was just a calf, really. But he presents this thing there, and he says, look, you're gods. And he's not saying, Yahweh didn't lead us out of Egypt. This golden thingy led us out of Egypt. But this golden thingy represents for us the God who led us out of Egypt. And God says, no, he doesn't. I decide what represents me, not you. So they're not, in their own minds, they're not changing allegiance to a different God, but they are thinking about God in such a wrong way that it ends up worshiping something else. And so again, we've got, however we resolve the question about how we think of Allah, clearly the worship itself is worship of someone, something different. The worship is too different for that. It's more like a golden calf scenario for that. And then you might say, well, they just don't know very well who God really is, and so they've got lots of wrong ideas about God. Or some would say Mohammed met some angel. He thought it was Gabriel, but it was a demon. Well, we would call it a demon because it's an evil angel. And constructs Allah as it's a different demon or deity. Or as I've sometimes expressed it, thinking of Allah as a fictional character based on a real person. As you get sometimes in old historical stories, King Arthur's stories in Britain, and you've got those stories here that are, or Merlin is a famous figure in British history as a sort of magician, which in some traditions was one who came to faith to Christ and some not, and so on. We don't really know anything about him, probably not even whether he existed. But he might be the sort of a fictional person based on some real person that is somewhere behind all this, but is now lost. Or like King Arthur, if he existed, we know virtually nothing about the real King Arthur, but we've got lots of fictional King Arthurs based on this person. Yeah, you know much more about it than I do, but I would incline to believe that Muhammad probably really believed that he had some sort of revelation. I don't think he just sat down and thought, oh, let's think of a new religion. And I don't think he just made it all. He just, there's something mentally going on in him. I don't know how and why, but I think he did believe that stuff himself. But what was produced there is a belief in the one creator God, and therefore that's why some people argue it's essentially the same God, but seen differently by the two religions or three religions. We've got a similar issue, of course, with Judaism. Orthodox Jews, do they believe in the same God as we do, but with a wrong understanding of it? Or is it a construction? No, I mean, Judaism is quite difficult to classify because there's so many different Jews believing so many different things. With Islam, I think we have a situation that may be similar to what we have here with Baal and Yahweh. It's not clearly not meant to be a separate entity. I think Mohammed had some contact with some Christians and with some Jews and incorporated some of those ideas. He did not think of the Allah of the Quran as different from the Allah worshipped by Christians and Jews. But what is then attributed to this Allah? And of course, he doesn't have a son and so on. That doesn't fit with the true and living God. And so the worship of it is certainly wrong. So something similar probably happening here that is condemned. On the one hand, you have clear idolatry, turning away from God altogether, offering obeisance to the stars of heaven, worshipping these as deities. And then you have the syncretism of mixing various belief systems and naming Yahweh as your God and your allegiance to God. Even at this time, we know from archaeology that lots of the names at that time were still names like Gedaliah, Amariah, Hezekiah, names that have the divine name Yah in them, particularly in the upper class. So Yahweh is still the official national God. So he's still the official God, but the way he's worshipped is all wrong a lot of the time. And the worship of this God is linked with worship of other gods. So I go maybe in the morning to worship the national God, go to the temple to pray for the prosperity of Judah and Jerusalem to our national God. And then I go home and pray to my little statue in the corner for protection of my family. And so on, because Yahweh's responsibility is the nation, and this little deity I've got their responsibility is for my family. So mixing religion like that. So that's the puzzling thing, that at first we start off with a very universal judgment. After the cutting off of humanity from the face of the ground, what more is there to be said, you think? And its seriousness is underlined by saying even all the animals are killed. So how much chance do you have as a human to survive? And the examples given, the birds and the fish, give us a picture of the whole world, not just the earth, so to speak, but think of heaven, the sky, the birds, think of the sea, the fish, everything. So this is but as comprehensive as it can be, which is why many people see here allusions to the creation story and allusions to the flood story. Which may be there, but I don't think they are as clear as many people think. There's no water here, for example. But it clearly is universal. There's nothing left. And then suddenly, we're focusing in on Judah and Jerusalem, and very specific people being condemned. And when the day of the Lord comes, hush before the Lord God, the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. There seem to be particular people invited to that. The Lord invites people to sacrifice, as He would do in those days. If you bring a Thanksgiving sacrifice, even if you bring a small Thanksgiving sacrifice of a goat, let alone if you bring a big one of an oxen, the principle of a Thanksgiving sacrifice is that there's a bit that gets burned for God, and then you eat the rest. Now, obviously, you can't eat a whole goat, even if you're eating as much as some people do. You can't eat a whole goat. The idea is that you invite others to that feast, because then meant to be eaten in community, in fellowship. And of course, the point of that is that in the Bible, a true praise of God is much more not telling God only how good He is, but telling others how good God is. The praise of God is in the assembly of the righteous. Throughout the psalm, the praise of God is not a one-to-one thing. It's not something I do privately. If I really want to praise God, I have a Thanksgiving sacrifice. I invite others to that meal, and they say, "What's the occasion? Is it your birthday?" No, they won't say that because they didn't celebrate birthdays, I think, in those days. Oh, is there a wedding? Is there what? No, I've got a big Thanksgiving to God because of this, that. And you tell the story. And that's how you praise God to others. He's shown me such great favor. What a wonderful God we have. Let's have a meal together to celebrate this. So the Lord now prepares a sacrifice, invites people, join me. And it turns out He has consecrated His invitees. You are the sacrifice. I've invited you to become the sacrifice on this day of the Lord. It shall happen on the day of the Lord's sacrifice. And here we get a list of the people. He doesn't sacrifice oxen and lamb and goats, but I will punish the officials and the royal household, namely all those clothed in foreign clothing. Oh, what's wrong with foreign clothing? Certainly in the West, that is a very odd condemnation. You think, oh, lots of people wear Italian and wear this and that. What's wrong with foreign clothing? But, and you're probably as aware, if not more aware than people in the West, clothing can be quite significant. Now, this tells you something about me, what I'm wearing. And today we've only got a remnant of that. In ancient days, clothes would tell you a lot more about people. Clothes were made locally, produced locally, and so and they show where you come from, who you are. And of course, in a Pentateuch, you've got even prescriptions about what Jewish clothing is to look like. The tassels and so on that remind you of God's commandments and so on. So if you wear foreign clothing, that shows two things in those days. One, you're rich, because only rich people can afford to get their garments from overseas. Normal people buy it from their neighbors. They produce the clothing in their village. So wearing foreign clothing means, yeah, you've got a lot of resources. And two, you probably don't particularly care for worshiping God, because you don't care about those tassels and all the prescriptions in the Pentateuch about what Jewish clothes should look like. So foreign clothing here signifies people who are one step removed from their local community and from the worship of the Lord. Even, if I may push that a little bit, rich people who are not supporting the local economy. And this may sound like a very contemporary concern, but remember in those days, in much of the world, this is a life and death issue. Lots of people were always living on the edge of subsistence. Each harvest had to be produced. If one harvest fails, you're in trouble. If 2 years' harvest fails, you're really suffering in famine. If you've got 3 years of failed harvest, people are dead, people are dying. Maybe after 2 years. Everyone is living very close to the edge. And so if you've got some rich people up there in the city who don't support you by buying your clothes in the village, but buy their clothes from Tyre and Sidon and those places, then it shows they have no concern for their brothers and sisters nearby. They think of themselves as an elite that has many more connections with the elite in other places than with the people down there. A bit like, again, apologies for the Western example, because I don't know the situation here well enough, but in former days, not of course now, when there were lots of monarchies in Europe, and they were all interrelated. The monarchy in Greece, monarchy in Germany, monarchy in Russia, in England, the Netherlands. They're all marrying each other, because you're not supposed to marry one of those lowly people. And so the effect is that you create a class of people that think of themselves as literally a different class of people. We only marry amongst each other. They have much more in common with the royal family in another country than with their own local people. And you've got a bit of that emerging here. Rich people who've got links and maybe friends buy their clothes from people in Tyre and Sidon and Gaza and so on, and don't have those same links with the villages nearby Jerusalem, are not identifying with their people. And it's those that form the sacrifice for God.